In today's video podcast, we are going to be talking about Greek archaic ceramics for our AP Art History, or if you're just here for an art history class, welcome. So, like a lot of Greek art, whether it's sculpture or architecture, ceramic wares, or the ceramics of the Greeks, also evolved over time. So, we begin in the Archaic period, and then we can look at art or ceramics in the classical, that being the early and the high and the late classical, and even some in the Hellenistic period. But we begin here in our Archaic period. Greek potters created beautiful ceramic wares, vessels, whose standardized shapes, so it was sort of mass produced, were tailored to very specific uses. These would be considered utilitarian. Um, and what I mean by that is that these vessels, based on their shapes and based on the looks that they had, either held things like olive oil or wine. Um, if you were not as sophisticated, sometimes they held beer, but they also held grains as well. So it was either wet goods or dry goods were found in these. And the potters usually signed their own works. Greek ceramic painters became accomplished at accommodating their images to, if you look at these shapes, these are very awkward fields. And they showcased not just figures, but they also told us stories. They created scenes of humans interacting with environment and humans interacting with gods. Two styles of pottery came out of this period, the Archaic period, and that was black figured vessels and red figured vessels. And so we'll begin our conversation with black figured vessels. So what we have is in the Archaic period, Athens became the dominant epicenter for pottery manufacturing and trade in Greece. Athenian painters adopted what was known as the Corinthian black figure technique, which became the principal mode of decoration throughout Greece during the 6th century BCE. And in the beginning, Athenian vase painters retained the sort of horizontal banded composition that was a throwback to the geometric period. Yet as time went by, they decreased the number of bands and increased the size of figures until they were creating narrative scenes, single narrative scenes, which would dominate each side of the vessel. So this was to be seen in 360 degrees. And we'll begin with this particular piece. This is done by a Amasis painter. And what we have is Dionysos with the minutes. I guess that's how that's said, the minutes. And what we have here, this was done in about the 6th century. It's an amphora. It's an all-purpose jug. It had bands of decoration above and below. We have central figures or composition illustrate this development. And the painting on this amphora has been attributed to the artist that we call the Amasis painter. It's a very distinctive style that you can tell. So we have two female worshippers of the wine god Dionysus, who's Bacchus in Rome, and intertwined with their arms and each other's shoulders, and they are skipping forward. And what they're doing is they are giving tribute. They're doing some sort of offering to Dionysus, and what it is a long-eared rabbit and a small deer. And they're going to offer this to the god. Amasis signed his work just above the rabbit, and our two female worshippers are holding the deer, wears the skin of a spotted panther, or it could be a leopard, we're not really sure. Its head is still attached, draped over her shoulder, and secured with a belt at her waist. Now, the god is sort of imposing. He's richly dressed, and he clasps a large wine cup, a cantharos. This is showing us this encounter between humans and a god, and it appears to be celebratory. It appears to be joyful, rather than something of reverence that we might see in other works. Amasis painter favored strong shapes and patterns over the conventions of the time. Our painter has made fine details such as a large and delicate petal and spiral designs below each handle. And the figures are meticulously arranged. Just look at the hair and the bold patterns on their clothing. Now, this is probably one of my favorite potters and painters. He is probably one of the most famous of the Athenian black figure painters, and this is Ezekiel. And he took his subjects from Greek mythology, which he and the people that have hired him probably considered to be history. And what we have here in this, he has portrayed the Trojan War heroes Ajax and Achilles in a very rare moment of relaxation, playing a game of dice. The vessel is an amphora. A strip around the belly of the bulging form of this amphora was reserved by Ezekiel. This was created right around the mid-6th century. And again, he signed it. We have this narrative again from the Trojan War. Achilles and Ajax sit across from each other. They've come away from the battlefield, maybe, and they're supporting themselves on their spears. And this kind of creates this sort of angular element, and it kind of creates this letter V, and you can probably keep the lines going and create sort of an X out of it. And you have this block that's between the two of them, and this is serving as sort of their makeshift game board for their game, and they're playing dice. And if you look really closely, if you're in your textbook, you'll see that there are words. And so Ajax is calling out 3. He's rolled a 3. The word is written out diagonally on the pot surface, and Achilles counters with a 4. So he wins this round. And his victory in this game could be a sign, it could be a warning of something bad that's going to happen. We know what happens to Achilles. By the visual prominence of the boldly silhouetted helmet perched on top of his head. Ajax's headgear versus that is just sort of casually set aside along with his shield. It's leaning up against something that's behind them. Now, if we were, looking at this in the time, us being the Greek viewers, we would have perceived the tragic irony of Achilles' victory in this playful diversion into the serious contest of battle. And Achilles, we know, would be killed, and soon afterwards Ajax would take his life. So here are two amphoras that on the left we have the two images. That is the storyline of Achilles being killed, and on the right we have Ajax burying the hilt of his sword into the sand, and he's going to lay himself on the sword. And if you look, and it's very sad and very somber because Ajax feels that he has let his best friend down. And it's a very sad moment. Even if you look at the palm tree in the background, it's turning down, and it even looks sad. So we have these very poignant narratives, masterful compositions, the crisscrossing in the earlier piece as well, and sort of the angles. We could see Ajax as his shield and his spear are almost in the same position as the game board piece as well. And our artist has created this careful contours that convey a sense of 3-dimension of human form, and the arrangement coordinate with the shape of the vessel, and it works well. There's a sense of harmony. There's a sense of elegance in this piece, and this is what makes Ezekiel like the man of the Archaic period. So now it is evolution in ceramics, and now we go to red figure vessels. And I really do like the red figure vessels because there seems to be a sense of pop from that nice black background versus that sort of gold background we saw in the earlier pieces. And so this was in the last third of the 6th century. We see this art style. Painters were still creating a lot of beautiful black figure wares, and some began to kind of walk away from this meticulous process, and they started to experiment with this new, more fluid technique called red figure. And in this mode, red figures stand out against a black background. That's where you kind of get that pop from. And the greater freedom and flexibility that resulted from this style, rather than engraving as you had to do in the black figure, that the detail led the ceramic painters to adopt the red figure more and more. It created a livelier human figure with a more developed sense of form, qualities that were increasingly in demand for Greek artists on multitudes of levels. So what we have here is from the artist Euphronios. He is one of the best known red figure artists of the time, and he is rendering the death of Sarpedon, and this was done right around 515 BCE. And the type of vessel we see here is a calyx crater because of its handles being curved up like a flower, like a flower's calyx, I guess. And such a vessel would have been used as a punch bowl during symposiums. And symposiums were these social gatherings of the rich and powerful and philosophers, and they would have these discussions and they would have battles of the wit with one another. As they got more drunk, the battles got even funnier as time went by. According to Homer, who wrote the Iliad, Sarpedon was the son of Zeus. This is the storyline. And a mortal woman was killed by the Greek warrior Patroclus while fighting for the Trojans. Euphronios has captured the scene in which the warrior is being jetted off to the underworld, because we don't leave these people on the ground to the dead. Euphronios has created a balanced composition because what we have here are two things. We have the sort of horizontal banding where the body of Sarpedon kind of lines up with the vegetative bands that are both above and below, but yet we also have this verticality as we have our figures standing up. So we have the horizontal dead figure of Sarpedon, and he seems to be levitating as we have the gentle grasps of his bearers who are Hypnos, sleep, and Thanatos, which is death. Also, if you look at the backs of Hypnos and Thanatos, you'll see that their backs are trying to line themselves up too with the upper and the lower bands. The upright figures, their lance bearers on either side, and Hermes in the center, counterbalance the horizontal and the diagonal elements of the composition. And while conveying a sense of energy and mass of human subjects, Euphronios also displays the elaborate details of their clothing. You really have to look at this. And the anatomy and the facial features with a fine-tipped brush. He created the impression of real space around the figures. And there's this gentle foreshortening. If you look at Sarpedon's left leg that appears to be coming towards us, well, that's just foreshortening. It's a sort of lifting his body as he's coming into our space. So again, just to remind you, this is our Archaic period. We have black figure and we have red figure. And you also have to remember in this is that all ceramics serve two purposes. They held a liquid like olive oil or wine, and they held a grain. So they had a utilitarian function. They also told a story. That just wasn't figures painted on the side of the vessel. There were narrative stories, and most of them were mythologies or wars or things like that. Now, some things to think about are other works of art that serve a utilitarian purpose, that not only serve to tell a story, but had some sort of function, that they just wouldn't sit on a shelf and collect a lot of dust. Well, that's it. Thanks for listening.